We are delighted to have everyone here in recognition of U.S. Constitution Day. This is our TCS Community Impact Series. My name is Jen Fullick. I work in our Community and Global Engagement Department supporting colleges of law, and really thrilled to support this event today. Personally very interested in listening and learning today as well from Professor Carter. The topic today is there a right to lie? And I'm going to give just one more minute because we have a lot more people joining. Give it just one more second so they get a chance to hit the "they're okay with recording" button and hear everything. The session today is brought to us by Professor Jared Carter at Colleges of Law. Next slide, please. This is a community impact series. It's brought to you by TCS Education System and in sponsorship and in partnership by the Santa Barbara and Ventura Colleges of Law. We provide these experiences for our community so that we can share current topics, emerging issues, and have discussions that matter. And the reason we want to focus on this topic today is apparent in any news story, article, anything you're reading every day, every morning, when you may be Zoom scrolling, when you may be looking at the news or online. So we are delighted that Jared can talk to us about this topic today. Next slide, please. So a few tips before we begin. So if you can, just go ahead and keep yourself on mute while we are listening to the presentation, but do use the chat box. We can pause for questions anytime. We will have some Q&A time at the end. And if you do have any glitches or issues with technology, please be patient. We do know, especially today, our friends in Chicago have been experiencing a lot of internet issues across the city. So if you fall off and need to come back in, that's okay, we understand. And if there's anything else, we will record this session, so we'll be able to send it out to all participants. So we thank you for your patience and your participation today. Next slide, please. So a little bit about our speaker today. Professor Jared Carter, he's a veteran attorney, assistant professor of law, and associate director of the Cornell Law School First Amendment Clinic. He is focused in social, legal, and economic justice advocacy and is the director of the Vermont Community Law Center. We're thrilled to have Jared speak with us today. Professor Carter is going to talk to us about items that are really topical on this U.S. Constitution Day. So go ahead, Nancy, if you can take us to the next slide. I think we're turning it over. Oops, sorry, not the next slide. We're going to turn it over to you, Jared. And we welcome everyone here with us today.
Great, thanks, Jen, and great to see everybody here. Appreciate, again, the Colleges of Law inviting me to talk to you about these important topics. And I think the idea of this being part of a community impact series, to me, just makes so much sense. Yeah, it's Constitution Day, or it was a few days ago. And my guess is probably, except for the really nerdy law students and law faculty like myself, you probably didn't, break out the barbecue and the beer to celebrate Constitution Day. It's possible that maybe we should have, but I do think in fact, we definitely should have. But nonetheless, I think at the very least, talking about these issues now as part of this community impact series makes a lot of sense. So I'm very happy to be here. And again, thanks to the College of Law and TCS and everybody for inviting me back. So I'm here in upstate New York. So for those of you who perhaps haven't been here before this time of year, it's quite nice. The leaves are starting to change. There's ripe apples on the trees. People are making apple pie. The smell of apple pie wafts through the community. It is quite idyllic in a lot of ways. But winter's coming. And I think that we're going to have probably another difficult winter here in upstate New York and across the country and around the world. And so I think it's always worth starting these conversations when we talk about community impact to reflect on where the community has been. And I think this connects directly into what I want to talk about, the First Amendment and whether there is a right to lie. So let's just reflect and you know, this isn't an all-inclusive list, but it's been a tough couple of years, as we know, right? Obviously, COVID, 700,000 people passed away, surpassing the pandemic of 1918. Work, school, families, we're all doing this via Zoom. It's been completely upended. We've had George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests and advocacy around that. We've had serious and significant allegations of a fraudulent presidential election. We had January 6th. We have tremendous, I think, confusion and misinformation around vaccines, around Delta, around mask mandates, around mask requirements. And that uncertainty largely comes from the media, ourselves, our political leaders, and the impacts of social media on propagating a lot of these falsehoods. So I say this not to sort of start this conversation off on a negative note, but simply to say I think it's entirely natural that if you look at all of these things that are going on, one can't be blamed for maybe being a little bit scared, for being a little bit, feeling a little bit like we're out of control in the United States. But here's the thing. We need to understand that it is a bit out of control. Democracy can be messy. They're certainly not good, I don't think, at quick and definitive actions, right? There's confusion. There's differing opinion about what is fact and what isn't. There's differing opinion about how to interpret the facts to come up with the right policies, the right decisions. And of course, there are people who lie because it's in their financial, political, or power interests to do so. And that leads, I think, to this sense of confusion and perhaps sense of feeling overwhelmed by all of these things. Jan at the beginning listed some of the places we might see these in the news, in our social media feeds at the outset. And I do think that's led to this real sense of angst. I certainly feel it, and confusion. And I think, truthfully, if we're going to be honest, we have the First Amendment to both blame and thank for that, right? And I think it's totally normal when things feel the way they've felt now and over the past year and a half, and probably at least in the near-term future, to turn to look to blame something or someone. That's not the right response, but I think there's an element of that response that's perhaps natural. And I think right now, the First Amendment and its protections of speech, of the press, to assemble, in particular, are a place that people are looking to point to and lay blame because of all of this, let's call it static that's out there. Lies, misinformation, fake news, whatever you want to call it. Right? This idea that you shouldn't be able to get away with doing this. Look at what it's doing to society. Right? It's harming society. And I don't think those people are wrong. I think words do harm. Right? Words do harm in this moment. So I think this is all to say, I think the timing of this conversation in the context of the Community Impact Series is ripe. Right? Is there a right to lie with so much at stake? Literally everything at stake. That's a really difficult question. It's a really difficult question. Are there penalties for lying? Should there be penalties for lying or spreading false information? It's a really difficult question. We have so much at stake and so much static out there, so much of this misinformation, these lies. It's a really hard question. What about people who are directly impacted and harmed by these lies? What recourse should they have? Right? Of course, nobody wants to be harmed, and no one, well, Most people don't want to harm others. Should there be penalties for this? So I always like to start these sorts of conversations with the primary source, right? I always say as a lawyer, go to the primary source, go to the materials that provide the support for the points that you're going to make. And so let's start with the First Amendment itself, right? We all have a general idea about what the First Amendment does. I'd argue that it's first for a reason, because all of the other rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights, whether it's the Second Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, all of those in many respects are subject to our ability to speak freely, of the press to speak and write freely, of our ability to peaceably assemble. All of those other rights depend on that. So I think the First Amendment's first for a reason, but here's what it says in a general paraphrase, right? Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, of the press, of the people to peaceably assemble. So why is this important? What does that mean at its core, right? If we're going to talk about if there's a right to lie, there's somehow this right to create all of this anxiety and angst and misinformation and fake news. Think about what is that really all about at its core, those words. And I think at its center, it's a basic belief that the government should not define political, social, or cultural orthodoxy, right? Or control, put differently, control what people think and what people talk or write about, right? Yes, the result may be fake news, lying politicians. We know we've got them, right? Facebook bots trying to influence elections. We know that's a thing. But I think at its core, the First Amendment and those words, those very few words, protect the space for what we call the marketplace of ideas to compete, right? On the theory that the truth will emerge through that, yes, messy, confusing, difficult process in which there's a lot of static, for lack of a better word. And that, at least in this theory, society will be better off if the government, because the First Amendment, remember, the Bill of Rights only applies to actions of the government, right? A private school or private company can't violate your constitutional rights. So we're talking about the government here. But the theory is that the society will be better off if the government can't define what is truth. Government can't define what is truth. And I guess if you don't buy into that basic premise, and I think certainly plenty of reasonable people are questioning that right now, but if you don't buy into that basic premise, if you don't accept that basic premise, it's pretty hard to justify a right to lie, right? It's pretty hard to justify much of what we see in terms of what people say and what they're permitted, in fact, what they have a right to say. So there are a couple of schools of thought that I want to just touch on before we jump into sort of the nuts and bolts of the right to lie, if it exists. There's a couple of schools of thought that I think underlie that core First Amendment principle. One school of thought is what we call absolutism, right? Absolutism is basically the idea that the words in the Constitution, in the First Amendment, say what they say. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, for example. And somebody that believes in an absolutist perspective on the First Amendment would say that means no law, right? Any law that burdens speech is unconstitutional. All speech is protected no matter what, right? No matter how hateful, how hurtful, how horrible the speech is. If it's speech, it's protected, right? That's an absolutist perspective on the First Amendment. That's not, I don't think, at least in the courts, it's certainly not the sort of mainstream approach to the First Amendment. The other approach is what I would call a categorical approach to the freedom of speech. Yes, it says no law abridging the freedom of speech, but of course, the classic example, it doesn't mean you can say fire in a crowded theater. You can't lie about a fire in a crowded theater, right? And this categorical approach, I think, considers that. And that's what I think the courts in this country under the First Amendment have generally adopted, right? That speech is protected, not acts, although some acts that speak can be protected in some instances, but speech is generally protected although there are categories of speech that are exempted from protection under the First Amendment, right? The society can place limits on certain types of speech. For example, something called true threats, right? You can't threaten directly another person with the subjective intent of putting them in fear of imminent bodily physical harm, right? It's a true threat, not protected by the First Amendment. Incitement to violence, right? We heard much about that after January 6th. Did the president or did the lawyers or did the other speakers at that event incite people to violence? If somebody incites, that's not protected by the First Amendment. Child pornography, not protected by the First Amendment. Obscenity, not protected by the First Amendment. And we get to something called defamation, right? Not protected by the First Amendment. Fraud, not protected by the First Amendment. Nowhere in there, though, is there a category called lies, right? Nowhere in there is a category called lies. So I think the first step here in sort of figuring out from a legal perspective, are lies, is there a right to lie, is to figure out what are the categories of speech that we're talking about, right? Right? What are the categories of speech does it fall under? Does a lie fall under? And the courts have looked at different categories of speech, and they said, for example, political speech, right? We're talking about politicians or a particular issue in a campaign is some of the most protected speech out there. They've said commercial speech, also protected, right? An advertisement, but somewhat less so. So the court, in other words, has come up with sort of categories of speech that are protected at different levels. So how much lying is allowed? Okay, I think the starting place here, the short answer to the question, is there a right to lie, is yes. There is a right to lie, right? And we carve out exceptions from there, right? Writ large, there is a right to lie under the First Amendment. But there are several key exceptions, and I'll talk about some of them tonight, that I think are relevant to our conversation as a community in light of all of these issues that we're facing. The first exception is something called defamation. I think you've probably all heard of it. Perhaps you even think you've been a victim of it, right? Defamation or slander, libel. The basic idea under defamation is that you can't make statements of fact that harm another person's reputation, right? Basically, it's a slanderous lie about someone else. That's defamation. And it's not protected by the First Amendment. So the courts, in trying to suss out what this means, right? What is defamation? When is it protected? When is it not? Have come up with a test that they apply, right? To have defamation, and therefore something that is not protected by the First Amendment, a lie that is not protected by the First Amendment, you've got to have a statement of fact, not opinion. Opinions are usually okay, but a statement of fact, published to a third party, in other words, spoken or written to somebody outside the person, the victim, and the alleged perpetrator of defamation. So published to a third party. You have to have, it has to cause injury, and it must be false. So if a statement is true, well, it's not a lie, obviously, so it wouldn't be part of this conversation, but in order to be defamation, it has to be false. So what the heck does this have to do with the First Amendment, you might say? Well, obviously, defamation is speech, right? Slandering someone or libeling someone is a form of speech, written or spoken. And doesn't the First Amendment say no laws abridging the freedom of speech? Shouldn't I be able to then say whatever I want? Well, no, I just told you defamation is an exception to that principle. So let's take an example and work through it. This, I think, will elucidate a little bit more how the First Amendment fits into this. Right, so what if I were to say, and I'm sure none of you have ever said anything like this about a political leader, but what if I were to say, the president is a murderer and a thief? President is a murderer and a thief. Can I do that? Can I do that? Let's walk through the elements of defamation. Did I just defame the president? Right? So what did we say defamation had to include? You've got to have a statement of fact. Well, I said he's a murderer. He's a thief, right? Those are statements of fact, right? You've got to publish it to a third party. Well, heck, I just said it to 41 of you. Lots of third parties in this Zoom room. I caused injury. I don't know, maybe I convinced some of you not to vote for him next time around, or not to donate to his campaign. So I may have caused injury. And as far as I know, the president hasn't been convicted of either of those crimes. So sounds like it was false. So did I just defame the president? Or was my speech protected? Was that lie, which I think we can generally agree is a lie, was that lie protected by the First Amendment? Do I have the right to say that about the president? Isn't that political speech? Isn't that sort of the core of the democracy that we live in? I think it is political speech. So the courts have come up with a way to protect this sort of speech. You might disagree with this basic principle, but the courts have come up with a way to protect this sort of speech under the First Amendment so that we can speak freely about politicians. And they've erred on the side of overprotecting, because the risks are, if you start to encroach on that ability to critique politicians, even saying something like the president is a murderer and a thief, well, then you go down a slippery slope. You go down a slippery slope. At what point, if the government's going to tell you what you can and can't say about a political leader, do you stifle that core political speech? And so the way the courts have done this, if they've come up with a doctrine called the public official doctrine. And I would say that this doctrine is critical to our democracy, right? Here's what I mean by that. Here's what the courts have said about that. The courts look at the victim of that defamation. So in this case, the president, right? The person I spoke against, that I made statements of fact that harmed his reputation. They look at the victim of the defamation and they ask, is that person a public official or public figure? Right? So the president's suing me for defaming him. All right. The courts are going to say, well, is the president a public official or public figure? And if the answer to that is yes, and I think it's pretty clear that the president is a public official, then the courts require what is known as a heightened standard. They would require the president to prove that I held actual malice against him when I made that statement, right? In other words, that I spoke or wrote or lectured in this lecture with knowledge that the statement was false, that I knew it was false, or with reckless disregard of whether it was false or not, right? Right, that I knew it was false, or reckless disregard for whether it was false or not. So if the victim of the alleged defamation is a public official, the speaker has much more leeway. It can't just be that I wasn't sure whether he was a murderer or a thief. If it was just that, or even if I was negligent in the way that I spoke about him in terms of doing my background research, doing my due diligence, that speech would still be protected. And I think the argument is democracy requires that leeway. And yes, we could prohibit that. We certainly could amend the Constitution to prohibit that sort of speech. But the way the courts and the First Amendment have seen that is that the ability to criticize public officials is paramount, right? To be critical of politicians is critical to elections. And the courts have also come up with a doctrine that's quite similar, but looks at whether someone is a public figure. So clearly a public official, a government official, like a president or a governor or a senator, we can say these things about, or we have much more leeway to say these things about. Courts have also said the same thing about public figures, right? Somebody that sort of wherein pervasive fame and notoriety affords them what we call public figure status, right? I'm thinking of people that maybe aren't government officials but are very, very famous, movie stars, musicians, actors, right? Public figures. And there's general public figures, which are people that are, for all intents and purposes, a public figure of such fame that they essentially are public officials. And then there's limited purpose public figures, who are people that in certain contexts are a public figure. So perhaps somebody that's leading a campaign in California for a ballot initiative, I think that's what you call them out there, that person might not be a public official, but in the context of that campaign, they're a public figure because they've put themselves into the spotlight. And so, again, the courts have said that we should be able to criticize people who put themselves into the spotlight in a political or public context, right? That's critical to our ability to function as a democracy. So the upshot of all of this really is to say, when it comes to public officials and public figures, we pretty much can lie. We pretty much can lie. Now, if that public figure can prove that you actual malice, that you knew it was false, or that you were reckless with respect to that falsity, then you may be in trouble. But as a general principle, if you believe it to be true, if I think the president ordered, a drone strike somewhere and it killed somebody, I could call him a murderer. I believe that to be true, even if it isn't legally true in the sense that he's been convicted, because he is a public figure, right? And this standard, by the way, doesn't just apply to us as citizens, but also applies to the media. So remember, the First Amendment talks about freedom of the press, also applies to the media. There's a very famous case, New York Times v. Sullivan, that's sort of the baseline for this basic principle. And it recognizes that when the press prints interviews or ads or op-eds that criticize, say, a politician or a public figure, they should not be liable. Otherwise, the press is going to self-censor, right? Or they should not be liable unless that actual malice is present, right? Otherwise, the press is going to self-censor, and it goes down a path that I think for many of us, we don't want to go down, right? So that sometimes means that things that are written aren't true. I'm sure you've all seen it, where a newspaper publishes the next day a statement retraction, or on the news or on a website. Now, many people critique those and say, well, the cat's already out of the bag, the misstatement's already out there, the misinformation's already out there, it doesn't really fix the problem. But remember, the flip side of that is if we start enforcing laws that prohibit the press or make it so dangerous for the press to speak on matters of public concern, right? What does that do to our democracy? In other words, would the cure, preventing that, be worse than the disease, the misinformation and some fake news, right? The idea, again, that the truth will prevail, right, in the long run, and that's better than defining truth from on high. Now, there's a critique of that, by the way. Right? Remember I said at the beginning, the marketplace of ideas, the truth will come forth from that as sort of the basic premise. I think certainly one could say that only those with the resources will be able to get the truth out. And so is it really a free marketplace of ideas? And I think that's a fair critique, certainly, of our system of media and politics in this country. But that's the underlying theory. So unless a public figure or public official can show that you had actual malice, you can essentially say things about them that you aren't really sure if they're true or not. And that's the way that the First Amendment deals with it in the context of defamation. So that's one area where there is an exception to the so-called right to lie, or it helps illuminate whether there is a right to lie. Another place that isn't quite so political, but I think is worth touching on at least briefly, and I do want to leave some time for question and answer at the end, is commercial speech. Has anyone ever felt like, and I know there's a lot of people in the room, so you can just raise your hand or put it in the chat box if you just want to share your experience if that's therapeutic in some way, but how many people have felt like they rented an Airbnb and the pictures looked awesome, and when they got there, it didn't look like that, right? I'm sure we've all had some sort of experience like that. In fact, if you'll allow me, a couple of years ago, I have young children, and they hate flossing their teeth. I don't know if anybody really likes to do that, but certainly my kids don't. And I was in a store, and I saw this, the rack of toothbrushes in the store, and there was one in there that said it was called Flossin' Toothbrush. I was like, wow, this is amazing. Like a toothbrush that will floss as well. And so I bought like a dozen of them and used them as stocking stuffers for my, my kids, my extended family. And I thought that this was genius. And then when they opened them up, in small print on the back, said, using this toothbrush is not a substitute for daily and regular flossing, right? And I was like, geez, that seems pretty deceptive. That seems like they lied to me. And I couldn't take them back because that time everybody used these flossing toothbrushes. So I was sort of stuck with them. The point is, it felt like a lie. How did they get away with that? Truthfully, for a long time, that sort of commercial speech, advertisements were not protected by the First Amendment. So they didn't have any sort of First Amendment right to say things in the context of selling goods. But in 1976, the U.S. Supreme Court recognized the First Amendment right to commercial speech. It said it's of slightly lower stature than political speech. It doesn't get quite as much protection, but it is protected. And in that 1976 case, Justice Blackmun said something that was pretty interesting. He said, not only does the First Amendment protect the right to speak, but also protects the right of the listener to receive the information. Which you think about is a pretty powerful thing. Pretty powerful thing, certainly in the context of commercial transactions, right? You have a right to receive information before you buy something. And from this, the court created this whole commercial speech doctrine that gets at, can advertisers lie, right? Whether it's a Facebook ad, whether it's a newspaper ad, a TV ad, can they lie? And what the courts have said is that consumer fraud is not protected by the First Amendment. So if an advertisement has the tendency or capacity to mislead, then it is not protected by the First Amendment. If it has the capacity or tendency to mislead, then it is not protected by the First Amendment. So I would argue that the flossing toothbrush had the capacity, in fact, it did mislead. Granted, the consumer was not very smart because who would fall for that? But that's not actually a valid defense in the context. It's the reasonable consumer. What would the reasonable consumer think? And the U.S. Supreme Court, in another famous commercial speech case, adopted something called the Central Hudson test. And under the first sort of element of that test, the court said, false and deceptive or misleading advertisements need not be permitted, right? So you can't lie in a commercial context. And they went actually even further, and they said that the government may require commercial speech to appear in such a form or include such additional information, warnings, disclaimers, as are necessary to prevent deception, right? So not only did they say the First Amendment doesn't protect the right of an advertiser to be deceptive, but in fact, the advertiser has an affirmative obligation to make sure that they're not, make sure that they're giving accurate information. Very different than what, in the context of political speech, is allowed. Again, remember I said, we let political speech much more alone to do its thing, not regulate it. We regulate commercial speech much, much more. So the next time that you rent an Airbnb that shows a picture of a pool, and when you get there, it's a frog pond, drop Central Hudson footnote in the review. Maybe you'll get somewhere with a refund, because I think it's false and deceptive. And if somebody's regularly in the business of renting an Airbnb, then they qualify under the commercial speech doctrine. So that's another area where the courts have grappled with lies. And in many respects, those decisions perhaps affect us equally or almost as much as the political defamation, public figure, public official doctrines do, because we're obviously surrounded constantly by advertisement and commercial speech. So one other area that I want to highlight just briefly, and then I want to think about a few solutions, because I've been talking about perhaps a lot of problems here. And I think some of the solutions come from the case law. Certainly law has something to say about it, and I certainly believe in the power of the law to make change. But I want to talk about some other solutions as well. But before we get there, I want to talk about one other area of speech that I think we've been talking about, even if we didn't know we were talking about it in contemporary society, and that is, for any law students out there, the speech of lawyers. Right? Lawyers get a pretty bad rap for speaking out of both sides of their mouths and defining this word that way and defining that word that way. And I think that's the basis for a lot of good lawyer jokes. But lawyers have very particular rules about what they're allowed to say and write. And perhaps some of you recall, and I think these are ongoing in some instances, the litigation and the lawyers who filed multiple lawsuits around the country alleging election fraud after the 2020 election. President Trump campaign lawyers who alleged election fraud in multiple states, right? You might say, well, wait a minute. Writing something down on a piece of paper, speaking even in court about their views of election, that there was election fraud. Well, isn't that political speech? Shouldn't it be protected? And I think certainly for you or I, as regular citizens, so to speak, it would be protected political speech. But lawyers have special rules that they have to comply with that impact their ability to speak. Lawyers are subject to special rules called, among other things, the rules of civil procedure. What are those for those of you who haven't taken civil procedure or aren't lawyers or soon to be lawyers? They're basically the rules of the game, right? They're rules that dictate how courts and lawyers should behave, should act, should do what they should do in the courts, right? That's why I say rules of the game. And there's a rule called Rule 11 in the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure that essentially says you can't go into court and make shit up. Pardon my language. But that's basically what it says, that a lawyer has to have some basis in law or fact. Otherwise, they can be sanctioned for those words, right? You can't say anything in court as a lawyer that you may be using it for an improper purpose, right? A statement in court must be warranted by existing law or have some factual basis, right? Otherwise, lawyers can be hit with monetary fines. And in the instance that I spoke of a moment ago, with the lawyers representing the Trump campaign, that's in fact what happened. They were fined financial fines to pay for the costs of those who had to defend those lawsuits, and they also were sanctioned with having to take particular courses, continuing legal education courses that were geared towards remedying their transgressions. And some of them had their ability to practice law in some states taken away. And you might say, well, that seems like a violation of the First Amendment right to the freedom of speech, right? These were clearly political things, but it's different for lawyers when you go into a courtroom. And some courts actually have even held for lawyers outside of the courtroom, speaking about matters that are in front of the courtroom. There's the court's inherent authority to make sure that they're functioning properly, and they can sanction lawyers for that. Courts have been pretty hesitant to go much outside of that because obviously lawyers have First Amendment rights in the broader public as well. So it generally looks at whether what they're saying or doing has some direct connection to a case that's before a court. But I think that's another special sort of exemption to the so-called right to lie. So I think this is all a long-winded way of saying, I think that yes, there generally is the ability to lie. I don't know if I'd go so far as to call it a right, but I think there's an asterisk after it. And I've talked about a few exceptions to that general right that I think are most relevant to our conversation. And I want to acknowledge that I think right now, with all of the chaos that's going on, one can't be blamed for wanting to tune that out, right? What are we to do, right? We could eliminate so-called misinformation. We could eliminate fake news. We could censor lies, right? We could pass a constitutional amendment to do this. And sure, some take advantage of our freedom to lie as a general rule. And it does harm us, right? But I would argue that even in sort of these, not sort of, but even in these very difficult times with so much at stake, that the answer is not to censor. Dean Gardine and I were talking at the beginning of this about the elections in Nicaragua, where I know she has family and I've spent some time, and the president there is literally jailing all of his opponents in that election. And I'm sure he probably says they're doing something wrong, they're harming the state, they're saying lies, but I think that's illustrative of the point, right? If the government has the ability to say what's true and what isn't, we run the risk of moving in that direction. And so I think, and I didn't make this quote up, I don't know where it comes from, but it's sort of a truism, that the solution here is not less speech, it's more speech, right? And I think one other thing is really important as we sort of contemplate this in the context of how we want our community to be. I think one thing we could all stand to remember, and I think this is a bit of a truism too, but is often forgotten when we see both sides sort of screaming at each other in a political debate. And I was reminded of this the other day. I was driving somewhere, I can't remember exactly where, and I saw the opposite sides of a political argument. On one block, there was one group, screaming yes, 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 and 3 blocks later, there was another group screaming no, no, no. And that certainly was well within their constitutional rights. Both of them thought they were right. Both of them thought they were telling the truth. But what struck me wasn't so much, do they have the right? Obviously, only one side is objectively right, I suppose, or only one side is objectively telling the truth. But what struck me more than that was they were screaming at each other from 6 blocks away. They weren't hearing each other. They weren't hearing each other. And so I think we could all sort of remember that the First Amendment really only works if we listen to each other, right? The freedom to speak is meaningless if there's nobody there to listen. And so I think as we're sort of thinking through solutions in these difficult and trying times, it's to remember that, right? It serves no purpose to simply scream into the void if nobody is listening, right? So we need to do a better job listening. And I think, remember, as Justice Blackmun pointed out in that 1976 case, about the important right, and I would say responsibility of the listener to receive information. I think we could all practice that. I think we could do a better job teaching that in our schools. Right? We need to understand civics, and not just in the way that, we can kind of all get up and say, my freedom of speech. Yeah, you got it. But I think there's also an obligation, I would say my responsibility to listen is the flip side of that freedom of speech. Otherwise, it's meaningless, and we end up shouting at each other, and we never really figure out, I think, solutions that work, right? So I believe, and I think this is worth considering at least, that with every right is a responsibility. First Amendment is no different. With our right to speak, and yes, perhaps to lie, comes the responsibility to listen, and to listen with empathy if we can. And I'll leave you with this sort of last thought, and then we'll leave the last 15, 20 minutes for questions. As we're thinking about lies, we're thinking about community, we're thinking about the Constitution, the power of the law, it's important to remember that there really can be no democracy without civil society. And that includes all of us, right? Not just lawyers or people studying the law and studying the First Amendment. Civil society is all of us. You cannot have, in my view, democracy without that. Can't have democracy without civil society. And there's no civil society without civility, right? Being civil to one another. Yes, speaking up for what we believe in, because you do have that freedom of speech, and your truth is your truth, and that's perfectly fine. But remembering that without that civility, we can't have civil society, and without civil society, we can't have democracy. So civility to me means recognizing that the right to speak comes with the obligation to listen. So all a long-winded way of saying, sure, lies are legal. In some instances, you probably have a right to lie, and others do too. And I don't know that I love that. But I think it's probably necessary as long as we remember that other piece, that responsibility to listen. I think it's probably an important piece of our First Amendment and our community, even if at times it feels like it causes more harm than good. So I'll leave it there. I've talked probably too much, and I want to hear from you all. You're welcome to put stuff in the chat, or Jen, I don't know how you want to sort of moderate this. I see there's some hands going up, but I'm happy to answer whatever questions folks have. Thank you very much.
Sure, Professor Carter, thank you so much. I think I certainly got something out of that in terms of the civic engagement side. You know, our duty to listen is something that for me, is a good takeaway in this day and age. So thank you. I would like to have an opportunity now for questions, and I do see some hands, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Feel free to put any type of question or comment in the chat box if you'd like. You're also welcome to unmute yourself. If you're not able to do that and would like us to unmute you, you can also just let us know in the chat box. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Nathaniel. I'm going to go ahead and Nancy, can you go ahead and unmute Nathaniel? Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My question is, looking at lying at mistruth is kind of a hard lie, soft lie situation. What do you think about the soft lie that is false equivalency? That is this kind of tendency within, as you talked about the media earlier, representing more of the moneyed interest in the country, to both sides, all of this stuff, to kind of like, this is a great thing, when in fact, you have a significant majority of a political party in this country that is openly opposed to democracy and openly opposed to all of the tenets of civility and talking things out, because it works to steamroll people, and authoritarianism is growing in popularity, not just here, but around the world. That's my main question, is these kind of softer types of lies, if they're not necessarily mistruths, but they may be more, it might be more of that kind of framing. So it's, I mean, the Overton window only covers so much when you're trying to get a hold of as many eyes. So I understand how that works in media and communications politically, but that's basically my question.
Yeah, I think a lot to unpackage there, certainly, and I appreciate the question. And I don't know that I don't have all of the answers to those things, but I guess what I come back to because I think you're right? Authoritarianism, it does work, but I think it only works for so long. And I think you see that, around the world, first of all, and second of all, it's not a society I want to live in. So I think it's really important to remember that we should model the society we want to live in. And that might sound, not I guess cliche is not the word, or maybe that sounds naive. And I wouldn't say that's necessarily a bad critique, but the reality is, if we don't like who is in power, we should speak up about it. And if they are able through their power to prevent us from speaking up about that, then we're in real trouble. But I also think that there are fringes. There's the silent majority that you hear about, and then there's the very vocal minorities, sort of the fringes of the political thought, and they take up a lot of space. But I think talking to those of us who don't necessarily fall into one of those far extremes or the other, you're going to end up appealing to that group, and I think much more effectively if we listen to each other, acknowledge each other, recognize that with speech is a responsibility to listen, even if we don't like that thing that they're saying. And that, to me, is the society I want to live in, rather than the authoritarian one where somebody can tell me this is the truth, this is not the truth. And I don't know there's a concrete answer to your question other than.
I understand. I'm not looking for like an absolutism. I just wanted to kind of put it out there and say, like, in the marketplace of ideas, when one person has an idea and another person is burning the marketplace down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How then do we proceed? Just food for thought. Thank you very much, Professor.
A great point, and it's certainly something that I very briefly tried to touch on. Right, this idea: is the marketplace of ideas really free? No. The answer is no. It costs a lot to get your idea or your party's idea or your interest group's idea out there into the marketplace. Right, it costs a lot, and so there's certainly problem, and that's in some respects a direct result of decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court and other courts and policymakers. But I think the answer to fighting back against that has got to be grounded in our ability to use our voices to fight back against that. And that's, to me, the critical aspect of the First Amendment, and why the negatives that come of sort of defining truth from on high, don't reach the benefits of allowing the pure freedom of speech, or as much as we can.
Thank you,
Thank you very much.
We have another question here, or comment from Dean Gardina.
Uh-oh.
It's a hypothetical for you, Jared. Could Congress pass a law that prevented social media companies from using algorithms that boost, target, or suppress certain voices? If the idea of the marketplace of ideas and that policy underlying the First Amendment is the idea that ideas could compete against each other, but if a social media company has created an algorithm that only sends me stuff that is consistent with what I've clicked on before, or suppresses particular voices, it seems like that's undermining the marketplace of ideas. So what do you think about Congress passing a law such as that?
Mm-hmm. In other words, making it so they couldn't use such an algorithm to sort of set things up. So certainly, as things are right now, as much as folks might not like it, these media companies have First Amendment rights. And so I do think it could be problematic for Congress to pass a law saying you can't speak in that way. On the other hand, I'm not sure that an algorithm, I don't know that this has been sort of analyzed by courts, but I don't know that an algorithm is speech. And so remember, like, acts generally can be regulated. So to the extent that this is that an algorithm is more of an act than speech, then I think it's would be then entirely within Congress's ability to do that. I'm very interested in the this whole question about social media liability that I know is sort of percolating out there, and what the impacts of that would be. In other words, if I post something on Facebook that ends up resulting in some sort of harm, can the social media company be liable for that? And I think that's another sort of interesting question as well, that invokes the social media company's constitutional rights. So I think if it's an act, it can certainly be regulated by Congress. If it's defined as speech or the sharing of information in some way, then I think it's harder.
Thank you, Dean Gardina. Jared, we have another question in the chat box from Jetta Kimball. Do government actors have a right to lie to the public because of national security interests?
Yeah. Well, the First Amendment and the principles that we talked about tonight apply to government officials in the same way. So I think the check on government officials is not sort of a fine or necessarily a sanction, although government officials could be sanctioned by higher government. The president could dismiss his Secretary of State if they lied to the public about something he didn't think they should be lying about, or misstating things. So there could be, that would certainly be okay to do. But I think sort of more generally to your point, there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits a government official from saying something that's not true, just like there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits you and I from saying something that's not true. So I don't know that I would call it a right to lie, but yes, the check on them is not, to arrest them or fine them. They could be voted out of office or removed by somebody who is politically accountable.
Thanks, Professor Carter, and thank you, Jetta, for your question. We're going to go ahead and take one last question if we have any additional thoughts, ideas, rallies, cries. Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for this great discussion, and certainly gives us something to think about the next time we are in a Zoom, scrolling on our phones and looking at the news. I think it gives us a good context. So, Professor Carter, thank you so much for addressing a very important topic. I'd also like to take a moment. We have our both our Dean and President for Colleges of Law here to provide some closing words. So I'll turn it over to Dean Gardina.
Yeah, so I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I want to thank Professor Carter for his presentation, and what definitely came through was that this is an incredibly complex area. And if you're thinking about the role of technology, as we started to talk about with liability for social media companies, as well as algorithms, and are they speech, and could they be in some way prohibited or altered? That's the places where the law has not yet caught up with the advances that we've made in technology. And so you guys are going to be part of that wave of attorneys who are going to be grappling with the law and technology and the law of technology and trying to figure out how those things work. So really excited that you decided to come tonight and listen, and I look forward to seeing many of you soon.
Thank you, Dean Gardina, and some closing thoughts from our president, Niemer.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fullick and Professor Carter. Thank you. I've been to a number of your talks over the years, and I always learn something new. I really appreciated your insight and analysis on this topic, and especially your closing message on the importance of civility. So thank you for joining us. Thank you as well to Dean Gardina and the academic team for putting this program together in honor of Constitution Day. And of course, you, Jennifer, and your team for sponsoring these community impact programs. I think you can see here on the screen, I'll just give a plug for our next one. We're going to be back on October the 7th. It's a midday forum. I put this message out to our community earlier this week. We'll be hosting a mayoral forum featuring all 6 candidates of the mayor race for the mayor of Santa Barbara. And now you may say, I'm not a resident of Santa Barbara, maybe you are, but I think it'd be good for you to come if you can, because a lot of the issues going to be discussed, whether it's going to be homelessness or housing or economic development, are all issues that pervade communities across California, for that matter, across the country. So we're going to have those topics coming up in a week from next Thursday, and all of you are welcome to join us. So thanks again for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Niemer, and thanks everyone for attending. We'll go ahead and close out, and we'll be sending the recording to everyone that joined us today. So thanks again, and have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.